Ani Boju, Nosque Indigenous, Dashpan Zibing, Dunjaba, Ajijak and Dodam, Anishinaabe, Kwe, and Dao. And I just want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee nations, and we have guests and settler nations with us on this territory that we share the land with. I also want to acknowledge that in this particular area, because we have a residential school, we have a couple of residential schools that are really close to us. The Mohawk Brantford Residential School and the Mount Elgin Industrial Residential School, day school. I just want to acknowledge the survivors and their families today as September 30th approaches. And I'm still not sure if that's going to be a federal holiday where everybody gets the day off, or if that's not going to happen until next year. I don't know, but I want to make sure that you are holding space for that day and the survivors and their families. Miigwech. There we go. Incorporating diverse sources of Indigenous knowledge. This information, well adapted to this territory, comes from the Pulling Together Guide, a guide for curriculum developers. And you can find this online. So I encourage you to explore it. And when you are exploring these resources, please don't think that you can't reach out just because they're in BC. Like I said, I've adapted to the best of my ability to this territory. So the purpose of this session, we're going to identify authentic Indigenous resources. We're going to be using Indigenous content appropriately and avoiding cultural appropriation. We're going to talk about incorporating local land, knowledge, and language into curriculum content. So the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, uses this definition. Local and Indigenous knowledge refers to the understandings, skills, and philosophies developed by societies with long histories of interaction with their natural surroundings. For rural and Indigenous peoples, local knowledge informs local knowledge informs decision making about fundamental aspects of day-to-day life. And as usual, I encourage you, if you have any questions or comments, jot them down as we go. That way you won't forget them. So, appropriate use of Indigenous content. When you're selecting resources for your curriculum, it's important to incorporate authentic Indigenous resources. But what does it mean to be authentic? And how can such resources be incorporated in a respectful way? These are good questions. As a curriculum developer, it can sometimes be hard to know if efforts to bring Indigenous content and pedagogy into curriculum are a respectful inclusion or an instance of cultural appropriation. So let's define cultural appropriation first off. And according to the curriculum guide, cultural appropriation can be defined as using intellectual property, traditional knowledge, cultural expressions or artifacts from someone's culture without permission. It is most likely to be harmful when the source culture is a group that has been oppressed or exploited in other ways, as with Indigenous peoples, or when the object of appropriation is particularly sensitive or sacred. And you'll see some examples later on. So example number one, cardboard box totem poles. In a learning exchange video series, Appropriation, Susan Dion gives the example of elementary school educators having their students make totem poles out of cardboard boxes. She explains that this activity trivializes the importance of poles in Haida culture. Dion compares making totem poles to having children make a model of a Catholic chalice and host and pretending to give and take First Communion. This would clearly be recognized as inappropriate and offensive. Here's example number 2. The Thunderbird and Whale Protection and Welcoming Pole, Learning and Teaching in an Indigenous World. The University of Victoria's course, Thunderbird, Whale Protection and Welcoming Pole, Learning and Teaching in an Indigenous World for the Faculty of Education was pedagogically based in an Indigenous teaching and learning experience. And what that means is they involved Indigenous knowledge holders in the community that those knowledge holders were from. The course involved the construction and installation of a Thunderbird whale house pole. Pre-service teachers and education graduate students and faculty worked alongside an Aboriginal artist in residence and an Aboriginal mentor carver educator. As part of an interactive learning community, the students experienced the principles of traditional Indigenous ways of teaching and learning, mentorship, and apprenticeship learning. Learning by doing, learning by deeply observing, learning through listening, telling stories, and singing songs. These are just some of the pedagogical examples. Learning in a community, and learning by sharing and providing service to the community. So let's look at a comparison. So the cardboard box totem poles. Indigenous communities weren't asked. The Aboriginal mentors or knowledge holders weren't brought in. And so the children don't learn the significance of what goes into making a totem pole. And they did not grant permission to the teacher to make poles. So did the teacher go and ask if it was okay? The teacher did not. They just went ahead. This happens a lot with dream catchers too. Poles have a spiritual significance which was not honored in the activity. The creating of poles was not interwoven with indigenous approaches, but was a one-off assignment within a predominantly westernized approach. And that's a big part of the problem. When you're trying to bring indigenous knowledge to the classroom, you have to be careful about when an indigenous person, when you should invite them to the classroom and when you're able to share knowledge. The polls on the right, the Indigenous community experts were actively involved. The activity was deeply integrated with the Indigenous pedagogical approaches. The spiritual significance of the poll was recognized by following proper protocols and values. So to me, that means that after they had, let's say, birthed the totem pole, usually there's a feast for the community, there's a celebration. And so here's a few examples of cultural appropriation that we see every day. It can be understood as using intellectual property, traditional knowledge, and cultural expressions or artifacts from someone's culture without permission. So in all of these examples, we can see the headdress. And the headdress is a very symbolic, important part of Indigenous culture. I've never heard a teaching where an elder said it's okay for a half-naked woman to wear one well in front of hundreds of people. The middle picture is, and you can find these images on Google. There's articles that go behind them too, and I believe I've included them in the references slide. But the second picture is at I believe a Cleveland Indians game. And here you have an Indigenous man probably having a conversation with this man who's got a very sad-looking headdress on his head. The third picture, this happens a lot too. Artwork is appropriated. So her story was that she was inspired by Norville, so I'm going to mess his name up, and I practiced all morning, Norville Morsel. And you can see the artwork behind her, where she says she didn't appropriate him. She was paying homage to him. Another example is the dream catchers. I specifically took this one off of Wish because these are the ones that we see all the time in the stores imported from China. No indigenous nations are making money off of that. So, what is authentic? What is authentic indigenous knowledge? Culture Shock Jewelry, which is a company of Catherine Pasquat, who is our Aboriginal outreach coordinator here. She designs, creates authentic indigenous pieces as well as jewelry pieces. We have the Native Wonders Gifts and Gallery, managed by Mark Peltier, which I hear has excellent food. Very good Indian taco there. This is Susan Dion, and I like the words that she shares, and I'll read them to you. This history is a shared history. It's our shared history. If you live on this land, then you're in a relationship with First Nations people, whether you know it or not. So teaching the history and teaching the content is your responsibility. And I say that, but with a word of caution, because you can appropriate and sometimes make a mistake around appropriating. If you don't feel comfortable, then that's an indicator that what you are planning to do is maybe not a good idea. Sometimes if you think if an Aboriginal elder came into my classroom and saw me doing this, would I feel defensive? And if you answer yes, then it's probably not a good idea to do that. Here we're going to hear from Joanne Archibald from the Solo Nation. And she's going to explain how stories reflect a worldview and she'll discuss how we need to be aware of and understand protocol, context, and process when using Indigenous stories, whether they are traditional or based on personal experiences. So this is another example, if you will.
If teachers are interested and keen to use Indigenous stories, I think that that's great, and it can be a very, I think, beneficial form of pedagogy. In order to do that, I really believe that teachers need to understand and ask some questions first to prepare themselves to get ready to use stories, with the students. What helped me in my learning journey was that I formed relationships with cultural knowledge holders and elders, and I asked people in a sense, about ways that we could use stories. I I watched, I listened to people tell stories, and I know that it may take some time for teachers to do that, but I think it's vitally important for teachers to find somebody in their school or school district who would be willing to in a sense be a mentor or a coach to help guide them to understand the answers to maybe these questions. What are some of the cultural protocols or guidelines that are used for various stories? What are some of the purposes of stories? Sometimes stories can be used in a public forum, so they're teaching stories, which are the ones I use in Indigenous story work. Other times, stories can be part of a community or families under their stewardship. And so at those times, maybe only those family members can tell the stories. Um, I think that a teacher needs to understand what types of stories exist in the local community in which they are teaching, and then to learn to understand how to use the stories, right?
Mhm.
I mean, some of the protocols that I learned about are ones where the storyteller acknowledges the source of the story. And I think this is an important form of protocol. So if I tell a story, I usually acknowledge um, the storyteller, the indigenous culture from which the storyteller, is a member, and then I may also provide some background, contextual background for the story. Maybe it's the cultural context in which the story um, comes from, or perhaps how a story might be used in a cultural context. So I think that that's a basic form of protocol. So teachers may actually use stories that Indigenous people from various communities, have developed teaching resources. Perhaps they've published their own stories in book or in video form. And I think those are ones that teachers should feel comfortable using if they've been developed by Indigenous people.
Mhm.
And in doing that, they can then follow the protocol of indicating, who told the story, which culture is represented in the story, and then perhaps find out, are there particular Indigenous ways of working with that story that fit with the cultural community, and then perhaps have community members um, participate in some of the learning activities, or have some of the students go out into the community to talk with some of the elders or people from the community about the stories. And the other thing I want to mention with stories, that sometimes they can be traditional cultural stories, and other times they're more personal lived experience stories. So those are the two types of stories that I usually work with, and that I have used in Indigenous story work. And I think that teachers, in using personal life experience stories, will also need to understand about the protocol of, if they're sharing somebody else's story, then to, of course, get permission from that person to share what they told, or to have some way that that person can share their story, and and then use that as a learning experience for the students with whom they work with.
Mhm.
So here's our first activity. And of course, the ones who couldn't hear, um, you're okay. But I think if you want to participate, that's fine. But reflection on cultural appropriation. So basically, what Joanne Archibald was saying was that um, when you have somebody who is a holder of those stories, or who knows those stories, there's levels to those stories. So some stories are okay to share in public. It doesn't matter who you are. And I'll give you an example right now. Isaac Murdoch from Curve Lake First Nation. He's a Anishinaabe man, holds a lot of traditional knowledge. He shared this story with us one time at a conference, and it's always stuck with me because I still use it to this day. It helps me focus and not get so overwhelmed by what's going on with the residential schools and the kids being found, and you know um, all the issues that are surrounding that. But he had told me, he had shared with this group once. He said, adults, they tend to make things more difficult and challenging than they have to be, and I've learned this great way of just getting it done. And so we're sitting there and we're like, we're listening to him because he's about to drop this knowledge on us about how to get things done. And so he says, this one time he was at some kind of gathering, and there was kids, from like 6 years to up to about maybe 9 or 10 years old, um, within this group that he was in, and then there was the adults. And so to make a point, he had asked the whole group, kids and adults. He said, "We have baby birds here. And the baby birds can't get to fresh water. How are we going to get water to the baby birds?" And he said it was funny to watch this group because the adults went off and they had their their iPads out, they had their flip charts out, they were making pie charts, they were making graphs, they were making trails. And then he went and looked at what the kids were doing. And the kids had went and found a bowl, filled it with water, and said, "Here, Isaac, here's water for the baby birds." And so his story reminds me of the simplicity of doing things and not getting wrapped up in all those other big things, right? And so at the end of the story, he said, "You have permission to share this. You can retell this story." So I thought that was a perfect example of what Joanne was talking about. So reflect on the following questions. Have you seen examples of cultural appropriation? Have you seen examples of where culture was integrated respectfully? And how did they feel different? In your work, who could you turn to for advice on how and when to use Indigenous knowledge in your curriculum? So, if we're going to take a couple of seconds to reflect on that. And then I want to see if want to share. If anybody wants to share, please do so in the chat, or if you want to turn your mic on, you can turn your mic on. And I have to be honest and say that the dream catcher is probably the biggest example of cultural appropriation that I've seen. That you go in a dollar store and you can buy a kit in there for, I think, a couple bucks, and then there's no teaching behind it. It's just the packaging. So, and then in my work, even though I'm the Indigenous curriculum and pedagogy coordinator, there are still things that I'm learning because we weren't allowed to learn those things. My grandma wasn't allowed to learn those things. She went to Mount Elgin. So there are things that I'm still relearning, and there are things that I still have to reach out to my community to find out about. So for instance, I'll use September 30th, Orange Shirt Day, as an example. I deeply appreciate from the bottom of my heart what I'm seeing people doing, and asking questions about how they can support, or what can they do for September 30th. But with the discovery and the ongoing discoveries of our children who didn't get to come home, it's just been an overwhelming time, and it's been really raw for everybody. So I advise people to be patient, and read these resources about residential schools. Letty Library, Jennifer Suter has some resources. There's some resources on the CTL Indigenous page. Aboriginal outreach, Catherine Pasquatch. Everybody has resources to share, but it's a matter of the people actually picking it up and reading it, and trying to make something out of it, make sense, or what have you. So in my work, I turn to my community. I turn to my sister, who has her master's in professional Aboriginal education. And she was the one who influenced me to go get my master's. Um, oh, we have a hand up. Sorry, I didn't see it right away. Catherine. Oh,
Yeah, no, it's okay. I just put it up. No, I wanted to mention that when my son was doing his Bachelor of Architectural Design at Laurentian a few years ago, one of the projects, I think it was in second year, was building a canoe under the guidance of Aboriginal elders, which I know. I thought that was awesome. And the uh, I wanted to take that program and because it was all grounded in the local community, not swanning in as the expert, but what did the neighborhood want? What did the community want? Who are the knowledge keepers? So I thought that was pretty neat.
Miigwech, that is pretty neat. I have to say, Chippewa had one of the same experiences with their local university and their youth, and it was one of the greatest experiences that could have been provided to the youth. I remember my cousin talking about it with just a big smile on his face, building a canoe right from scratch, like going to get the birch bark that you have to peel and then bending the ribs and everything. His face lit up when he talked about it. So yes, that's awesome. Maureen?
Thanks. Recently, I've seen on television uh, an Indigenous woman who's talking about an Indigenous program that's now being offered at the primary school level. And I thought, shoot, we're so far behind. It would be wonderful to see if it's being offered locally and do it for all of our students if it could be done remotely. And it's called the moccasin identification. And so it requires that the students do a little bit of research, probably with some help if they're elementary school, to find out what treaty territory they're on, if any, and the people who control a territory, because there's a lot of territory in Canada that was never ceded, in any way alienated by Indigenous peoples. And it was wonderful to see that straightforward way of looking at footwear and realizing, unlike us, it's an identifier and it has meaning. So I just wanted to contribute that.
Thank you, Maureen. Is there any way you can pop some information in there for us?
Catherine may have done that. I don't know if that's about the canoe program or I'll look it up. This is Caring Society. I don't know what it might refer to, but I'll find out momentarily if there's a link I can provide.
That'd be great. Miigwech, Maureen. Go ahead, Megan.
Oh, hi. So I have one where I was part of an appropriation, I believe, because we didn't have an Indigenous elder to help us with it. We did, and then I have one that's a little more that we've advanced since then, but we had a young people's youth program at the university, and this was quite a few years ago now. We used the Inukshuk, because remember at that time the Olympics was using a version of that structure, but they were calling it the wrong thing. And like there was a lot going on. So we did some our own research and pulled from whatever we could find to give a metaphor for community and I am here and a way to start the journey for these young people who are creating original pieces. And then we did have Indigenous artists come into the program to teach, but we didn't really connect the Indigenous artists to the actual Inukshuk, which became this beautiful, they knew where it came from. It wasn't like we said, here's the structure. We did give them a history, but we didn't really have, I would have liked to have gone back and got the Indigenous artists to introduce it in the first place. But it was amazing to use that piece as a way to say, imagine how many people would need to be involved to get this structure even built. And then what did it mean for people that use these structures, and how can they see, like, I am here, that idea of I am here, and this is the way. And I think that year we did a piece called The Way Station. So things were kind of connected. I think we were on the right track, but we needed even more support. Yeah, because we did connect it. And then later I was doing a piece. I wanted my students to do a ritual piece. And I was like, I know my white, like how I was raised through my religion, not just a white religion, but it was an Indigenous culture. And so I had people from the community. I talked to Russell Nadi. Am I saying his name right? At the university, and then he put me in touch with Paul Pategus.
Paul Tattagoose. Yep.
Pedagogy, thank you very much. And then Jessica Cook was also working at the museum at the time. So they came for like peanuts. I think I even researched what I should give Paul, like a little red sack of tobacco. Like I even asked Jessica what I should give him, and I think some maybe Tim Hortons money, if that. Like now I feel like I would raise money to pay him. So it is interesting because he was teaching in the education building at the time, and we wanted to talk about ritual, and I wanted to talk about smudging because my colleague in grad school smudged us. He's Indigenous every time before a show as a way to cleanse our spirits and rise to the occasion. And it was he sang and it was beautiful. And I wanted to tell that story of what happened to me as an artist, but I felt like I couldn't. So I think that I did a better job the second time, but I've just lost touch with how, like, the ritual exercise kind of went out the window a little bit because they weren't sure how to use the ritual to create these devised pieces. And I think I'd like to revisit it, but that's who I turned to at the time. And I'd love to turn to them again and love to maybe be able to compensate them a little better than like the tobacco and everything. But I was trying. The point is I was trying, and they were there to tell me if I was wrong. And it's fun to see the different perspectives, because Paul's perspective of sharing and ritual and custom is different than Jessica's, and depending on their background. So yeah, so that's one where we kind of missed the boat, and one where I was moving in a better direction, I think, and finding resources.
That's fantastic, Megan. Once you start building those relationships, though, it becomes just a little bit easier, right? So now that you know Paul, you know Russell, and you know Jessica, um, I'm not saying it should be completely easy, but I'm just saying that you have that knowledge of who you can reach out to. And if they can't help you, I'm sure that, they've said that they could find somebody who might be able to help you. And thank you for sharing that. But it's so hard, right? It's like, what you were saying, you felt uncomfortable, but in my head I was like, well, yeah, that seems like an all right process to me. I mean, no university is set up to compensate our traditional knowledge holders. I think the University of Alberta may be the exception, but as far as I know, there's no honorarium system set up. When we have Indigenous knowledge holders come to the university, we have to get some particular information from them, like their social insurance number. And some of them are really uncomfortable with that. And so we need to find a way to work this out so that uh, you know, uh, uh, educators such as yourself have a pot to pull from when they do reach out. And so you're not getting your hand slapped by an Indigenous knowledge holder who's saying, well, that's an insult, because that's happened in the past. And it would help if we just had something there for the knowledge holders, the elders who come in, just to make sure that they're set up and they're getting taken care of. I think that's one of the important things too. Yeah, go ahead.
Is it an insult to ask? Like, like, how might I compensate you? Is it like something that's awkward? Because I went through Jessica for Paul because I didn't know what he would be in, like, if this little thing would be insulting, or you know what I mean? Because I had her as a friend at the time, because she was working with this group. I haven't seen them in 4 years, or 5 even. It has to be renewed. But is that an okay thing to say? Like, how would you like to be compensated? What are your...
Absolutely, because if you don't ask, how are you going to know? And if
Exactly.
you're going to assume, then you're going to, what's that saying? You're going to make an ass out of you and me.
Yeah.
And we don't want that, right? I apologize for my language, but we don't want that, right? We're done with those days of assuming. Let's put that in the past. Let's get something solidified so that we get our traditional knowledge holders and our elders taken care of when they do come to campus, or when we do invite them virtually, or you know what I mean? It shouldn't be it shouldn't be such a process. But I will share another thing with you too, is some traditional knowledge holders and elders might say, well, I don't know, what do you think you should pay me?
Ah,
And for that's happened to me. That's happened to me. Um, and usually when they tell me that, I'll just throw out a price at them, and if they look at me funny, I'll up the, you know, you know. Um, but yeah, you should definitely ask. Just ask for sure. It's not an insult. It's not. How else are you gonna know? How else are you gonna learn? Because each one is different, right? Like Jessica, you went to Jessica to ask about Paul. They're not the same in that way, were they? Exactly. So yeah, absolutely. I 100% encourage asking. Cynthia.
See, okay, hello everybody, and thank you for this great workshop. I just wanted to speak about that. I know it makes people very nervous about, I don't know what to pay and what's appropriate, and you know, I have twice worked at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research since 2007. I had done 2 terms with them. And this is a question that came up all the time between researchers and within universities. And so I'll just give you an example. When I brought in an Indigenous knowledge keeper before COVID, um, part of what you offer someone is kind of, I'm going to use the word common sense. So somebody's coming from Northern Ontario, and if you were to look at travel costs, like what would it cost them to fly here? What would it cost them to drive here? There is something, I think on the government website, they pay, I don't know what it is right now, 58 cents a kilometer or whatever. And so if you multiply that by, 1,000 kilometers, you can figure out a cost in terms of mileage. What I ended up doing, because I'm aware of this stuff, is that I paid all her food. Of course, I took care of her cab, all her food. I paid her a $500 honorarium because she was helping with the curriculum in the classroom. So the honorarium of $500, and I paid for her flight. So the idea is she pays for nothing. She's taken care of. I picked her up at the airport. I took her to the hotel. I took her back to the hotel. Well, actually, in that case, it was just across the street. So so that was convenient to the School of Social Work. But I took her to the airport. So anything, a way, if this was your auntie or if this was your grandmother, how would you want her taken care of if it wasn't you? But if it was you, make sure everything was taken care of. She has water, she has juice. What does she want to drink in between? Whatever. However you would take care of your most loved one is how you should treat Indigenous peoples that are coming to share their precious knowledge, because it's not just their knowledge, it's their ancestors' knowledge, right? So it's information and knowledge passed on generationally. So that's just an example. But yeah, it sounds like there's no specific protocol here at the University of Windsor, but it's easily done, easily done. And I'll just share this. This is kind of an ugly story, but this is where I want to eliminate that. When I was living in Ottawa, and I lived there for decades. In 2014, before I had moved to British Columbia for another position, the thing that was going around in Ottawa was, if you want Indigenous peoples to do something for you, whether it's speaking or doing a ceremony or whatever, it was kind of like, just give them some tobacco and they'll feel obligated and you don't have to pay for it. Well, I say bullshit to that. So again, be very generous. Indigenous peoples have been very generous to settlers, right? Our land. You know, anybody who's here in Canada benefits because you're on Indigenous land. So show that reciprocity, give back generously as much as Indigenous peoples have been generous to what we now call the nation of Canada. So I just wanted to share that. And feel free to share that story. Thank you.
That you just summed that up so succinctly, Cynthia. Big watch for that. Yes, absolutely. Treat them how you would treat your auntie or your grandma or your mom or your grandpa or your dad. Oh, great discussion. Thank you, Miigwech. So here I thought I'd include like a screenshot of, when I'm doing research, what it looks like about authentic Indigenous resources. Um, you know, the most recent one to come out of the media is Michelle Latimer, and that's still up for a great debate there. She produced and directed the Trickster series that was written by Eden Robinson. Very good series. I've read all the books. Uh, the series was well done, but it came out that Michelle's not. She has ancestors from the 1600s, and she's not directly affiliated with a First Nations. She claimed one, and they had asked who she was. I believe it was Algonquin Nation, and they're going through their own identity membership uh, challenges. So the argument was for Michelle was that you know are you indigenous by just claiming indigenous ancestors, or are you indigenous by how you interact with your community and your people? And if you go by the latter, she heard stories from her dad about being indigenous, but it, they were stories, and so it's all very tricky, and nobody has the one right answer. But for me, for somebody like Michelle Latimer to come along and take those spaces from authentic indigenous creators, that was an insult. It was an insult. So here we have, you can see it right away, authentic First Peoples resources pops up. And we got Strong Nation, the bookstore, online bookstore. I've ordered from them. And 21 things you may not know about uh, Indigenous peoples. And that's from Bob Joseph. So these are the things that just popped up when I Googled that. But let's go to it. Let's look at some authentic texts that are historical or contemporary texts that maybe, according to the First Nations Education Steering Committee, they present authentic First Nations, present authentic First Peoples voices, um, depict themes and issues that are important within First Peoples cultures. Example, loss of identity and affirmation of identity, tradition, healing, role of family, importance of elders, connection to the land, nature, place of spirituality as an aspect of wisdom, the relationships between individual and community, the importance of oral tradition, the experience of colonization and decolonization, and they also incorporate First People's storytelling techniques and features as applicable. Example, circular structure, repetition, weaving in of spirituality. And this is what I've seen. I'm sorry, I'm getting distracted by some of my grammar mistakes here. Whew. And some of these are what you see. So, for example, I started going to Sundance, and the Sundance ceremony here. Um, You know, you go to Sundance prep meetings where the creation story is told, and every time you hear it, you learn something new. And that comes in with the storytelling techniques. Um, the circular structure. So right away, I think of the medicine wheel and the four quadrants and the medicine wheel. Those teachings are always involve repetition too. And again, you learn something new every time because you have to remember it's not the same for every Indigenous community or Indigenous person that you come across. So, are you trying to decide if a resource is authentic? So you want to use pre-vetted resource lists. So if you go to the Center for Teaching and Learning page, we do have some Indigenous resources up there now. I've looked at these resources. There's a lot. I looked at them, which is good because you know when I was an undergrad, I struggled looking for resources. So we've grown a lot in that way. Reaching out to, consulting with the Indigenous Education Office at your organization. So that would be either Cat or Russell, but you know sometimes they get really busy doing things. So I would suggest reaching out to the educators in First Nations communities. Like for example, Chippewa Thames has an education department specifically. So reaching out to them, maybe seeing if they could help you it would be a good thing to do. Ensuring that proper copyright and protocols have been followed to obtain permission, particularly, when using resources found online, such as songs and artwork. So that's the big one. Um, Artwork for me because I'm a visual person. I love visual images, and so when I was putting together some of these slides, these presentations, Erica had to remind me to make sure that I mention the artist, that I'm not just lifting the image and appropriating. So we also need to recognize that local cultural protocols exist around the use of Indigenous resources. In the Western world, it's called copyright. In the Indigenous world, it's called oral permission. And for more information on deciding whether a resource is appropriate, you can review pages of, this is again part of the pulling together resource, the reference page. So you can review pages 8 to 16 of the guide in our own words, bringing authentic First Peoples content to the classroom. And so you'll see it's from kindergarten to grade 3, but really, I mean, if you're stepping into this and you're a new learner, you're a newbie, um, you know, maybe starting with something like that isn't bad. It's not a bad thing. You know, we don't always need to start right from the top. Maybe if we start being equal with those little learners, we'll learn just as much as them. So activity 3, consider the following resources and determine if they are authentic or Indigenous resources. Why or why not? Some of you may recognize these resources and some of you may not. That's okay. You can pop your answer into the chat. So the truth about stories, a native narrative by Thomas King. Is this authentic or not authentic? What do you think? Yep, very good, Cynthia. It's authentic. And it's an authentic resource because it has an Indigenous author who discusses themes that are important to Indigenous peoples. And he uses the storytelling features that we talk about. I've read this book, but to be honest, it's been so long, I can't remember a lot of it. Dances with Wolves, an Academy Award-winning film starring, produced, and directed by Kevin Costner. Is this an authentic resource? Not. Very good, Catherine. Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. This would not be considered authentic resource because it was not created by Indigenous filmmakers and reinforces stereotypes of Indigenous peoples. I remember when this came out, my dad, he turned it on for comedy purposes. Explore the animals. Northern Coast First Nations and Native Art Coloring and Learning book. Is this coloring book authentic? Right, Cynthia. We can't discern that information by just looking at it, right? So, I mean, it's tricky to authenticate because no information about the author or illustrators is provided, and these could be appropriated images within the coloring book. Further investigation is required to determine if the publishers had permission to use the images in this book. Orca Song by Anne Cameron, illustrated by Nellie Olson. What do you think? Authentic or inauthentic? It's hard to tell. But this is not an authentic resource as the author does not state that the original storyteller was involved in creating or editing the book in any way, or if the original storyteller received any profits from the book. While partnerships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous authors are acceptable, this does not appear to be a true partnership relationship based on equality. So some of them, you know, when I see stuff, I Google it right away. I'll go right to the back of the book. I'll go to copy out. I'll do whatever I can to find out if it's authentic or not authentic. Joseph Boyden, 3-Day Road. What do you think? Authentic or not authentic? This was, you know, this controversy. He's surrounded by controversy. He's in that, to me, he's in that category with Michelle Latimer because he grew up around Indigenous people. He was adopted into an Indigenous family. But the stories that he tells, he got them from somewhere. He got them from an Indigenous community, but he doesn't talk about them. And so when they don't talk about the community, like I don't live on my community. I've born and raised in Windsor. I might have lived on Chippewa for maybe 10 years in total, and then I moved back up here. But you know, I talk about my community. Come to my sessions, I'll mention my community at least once. You know, I talk about Mount Elgin. I talk about the residential school. Um, it is an incredible book. It is. But this is tricky because until recently, this was widely considered to be an authentic resource, right? And then his ancestry was called into question. That's what happened. So again, along there with Michelle Latimer, was he taking space away from Indigenous writers, Indigenous creators? And many people see his book, sorry, not his book, but see him as an example of cultural appropriation in which he pretended to be Indigenous to be seen as authentic. One's view on whether this resource is authentic is connected to what it means to be an Indigenous person and who defines an individual's indigeneity. But, you know, again, identity, right? You got to think about the Indian Act too when it comes to identity and how the Indian Act mucked all that up. And so as you're mucking through trying to find these authentic resources, and you'll find them and you'll use them, and that'll be good. You should look for opportunities to connect to the local land and language in the place where your course will be taught. So incorporating local knowledge is a good way to show respect for the local Indigenous peoples. It also models to local Indigenous learners that their culture is included in the curriculum. And it teaches students about local Indigenous people. So if the relationships are not strong, consider how you might build such relationships and look to sources of support within your network. For example, Indigenous support services at your institution or colleagues that have existing connections. And so what does that mean? What does that look like? What does it feel like? These are the questions that we're coming up against now. So like I said before, building relationships with local communities takes time. You have to put in the effort, you have to put in the work. Strong relationships will incorporate local content and collaboration with local community. So there's a partnership, there's a two-way, there's that two-row wampum that's happening, right? Um, but we're coming together to try and share our knowledges together. Working with elders and community experts. I know the University of Windsor is working on this. And I just, I want to be able to provide a space for our elders and our community experts to come where they can be comfortable and they can have a second or a minute or however long they need to take for themselves when they do come into the university environment, because it can be harsh, right? It can be cold. So hopefully, with the Indigenous strategic plan, that's hopefully we can work through these issues so that we can provide space and have our elders and our community experts come in. So I thought talking about the language, I thought it would be good to provide examples for you. So here in this territory, we have Anishinaabe-Moan, or Ojibwe, and then we have the Haudenosaunee language, or Oneida. There's Delaware, but it's almost there's a little bit different dialects there, but not too many. Um, but so Stats Canada 2006 said that Ojibwe was the highest spoken language still, with 56.6% speaking it. Followed by Oji-Cree, Iroquoian, I can't say that word, and Mohawk. So Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. The First Nations languages that are recognized within the province of Ontario are Cayuga, Cree, Delaware, Mohawk, Ojibwe, Oji-Cree, and Oneida. There is a greater variety of programming available in reserve-based First Nations communities. I know my own community, we have, I think, about 3 language initiatives going on right now, which is awesome. I love seeing it because it's virtual too. I can participate, even though I am off reserve and I live an hour and a half away. So language is closely linked to culture, and many cultural concepts cannot be accurately translated into other languages. And an example of this is many Indigenous languages have words to describe concepts that don't exist in English. When languages are lost, culture is also threatened. For that reason, language revitalization is very important to many Indigenous peoples. And as a curriculum developer, you may want to consider ways you can bring concepts from the local language into your course. For example, are there values, principles, or themes in your course that could be expressed through Indigenous languages? Uh, the so it's September, and I believe I can't remember the word for the month of September. But I wanted to use that as an example. There's an Anishinaabe word for September, and it has to do with the corn, and harvesting the corn, I believe. Integrating local Indigenous language into your course would certainly require collaboration from community members, and that's something that I could help you with. I wouldn't mind helping you with. And so here's a screenshot of local indigenous knowledge. So when I talk about local, I'm not talking just about Windsor. I'm talking about all these places. And you know, from a little ways past Amherstburg all the way up to past Toronto was considered my people's traditional territory. So this is local to me, even though, you know, Six Nations, I think, is like 2.5 hours away. But the rest of them are, you know, about 2 hours, hour and a half away, but they're local to me. And then our local Indigenous knowledge, local, here in Windsor, we have the Métis Nation of Ontario, we have SOHAC, Southwest Ontario Aboriginal Health Access Center, Turtle Island, Can-Am Indian Friendship Center, we have Can-Am Urban Native Homes, we have the Indigenous Legal Orders Institute, the Native Student Alliance, and those are just naming a few. So activity 4, I'll let you read those questions. And Maureen, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just quickly, was I'm putting together a research paper, and John Burroughs is one of my references, and he tells a fair number of Naganash, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe stories that are relevant. So I quote him, but I did find a word, Zaganash, that means specifically, according to the source, white English-speaking human being. And so in the paper, I've explained that and provided a reference. And throughout the paper, instead of saying Indigenous and non-Indigenous, for non-Indigenous, I'm saying Zaganash. And one of my goals is to help us understand what it feels like to be called a word that we've never heard before, right? We've heard settler, we've heard colonizer, we've heard white supremacist, we've heard all kinds of things. But what if your entire half a millennia of history, you've been referred to by the dominant culture as Zaganash? And part of the goal of the paper is to help people understand different life worlds. And I have to wait and hear what my Indigenous colleagues say about that strategy. But I just thought I would share it with you as an example of how to bring knowledge that appears to be public. And I have to, even though Dr. Burroughs' research is in Zaganash journals and widely cited across the world, I still feel obligated to write to him, show him the paper, and say, do you object to using your knowledge in this way in this paper? So anyway, I just thought I'd leave that with you, and that was my comment. Thanks a lot for the time.
Well, that's awesome, Maureen. I hope you get a response. Yeah, Shagnash, white man. Yep. Um, and it's not derogatory. You know, it's just that's that's what the ancestors saw, and that's how they describe them. So, activity 4, integrating Indigenous resources in your curriculum. So this is the big question. This is the big one, along with how do I do it? The big question is, how do I do it? So who could you reach out to for recommendations? Pop your answers in the chat. And if you have any, or suggestions. How can you find local resources? I just showed you that. How can you find First Nations, Métis, and Inuit resources? Showed you that again. How might you involve non-textual resources such as dance, art, oral stories, and ceremony? So for this one, land acknowledgement is the big one right now. And so and I like land acknowledgements, but I'm still developing my own because my relationship to the land here has been even before I was born. So my relationship was already since time immemorial through my ancestors and through my family. And so I would say to start off, if you need somewhere to start with a land acknowledgement and not just the generic one. um, talk about where your family comes from and how they came to be on Turtle Island and the benefits that they had from being on Turtle Island. And then I would even go one step further in your land acknowledgement, and as you're giving thanks to, um, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, for sharing this land. Go one step further and give honor to the residential school survivors in this area too. That's just a suggestion. But I heard a young man whose family came over from Poland. They were running away from the war there, and they settled here. And he said that his dad worked or his grandfather worked hard, and he passed that on to his dad, who passed it on to him, and worked hard with the land, farming the land and managing the land. And so they were able to make a living for their family from that. It was one of the best land acknowledgements from a non-native person that I've heard so far. But that's where I would start. Dance, jingle dress. The jingle dress dance is a known dance for healing. Um, Working with your local community to see who might want to come and share that teaching behind the jingle dress. Um, art, art is a big one. We are visual people. So when we see an image, or I've got 1,000 pictures of the sunset from every different day in my phone. But art comes in all forms. It can be physical, it can be mental, it can be spiritual, it can be emotional. Ceremony, ceremony, that one is a little bit trickier because it's private. I consider it a private thing. But Sundance ceremony on my reserve is open to everybody. So whether you're Indigenous or not, you can come and help, but you can't actually go on the lodge. So, there are things that you learn when you immerse yourself and you put yourself in those uncomfortable learning environments. So hopefully from this session, you have learned that Indigenous knowledge is diverse, that you consider including resources from First Nations, urban, Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And I say urban Indigenous because on reserve, I'll use Walpole for an example. They get a lot of partnerships from the university. Teresa Altman has created so many beautiful images, and the Turtle Island Walkway is just one example. They can come in many forms, including personal experience, oral communication, and other non-textual or non-verbal forms. Cultural appropriation is a complex issue. It is. There's no easy way. Sometimes sometimes it is clear and cut, and sometimes it's not. That's what we learned here, right? To avoid cultural appropriation, ensure you have permission to include resources in a respectful way. And I do this. I just recently reached out to the Anishinaabe Education Institute to see if I could use one of their resources. When selecting resources, consider whether they are authentic. So while Joseph Boyden or his wife may have written a good book, um, given the controversy around him, do you want to use his work still? Or would you prefer using somebody like Thomas King? Look for opportunities to incorporate local knowledge and contribute to language revitalization. So even, including like Maureen is, including, Jagnash in the paper. I appreciate that. These are free courses, but they do offer you the opportunity to purchase a certificate for your resume or your CV. I did the University of Alberta, a massive open online course, which is also known as a MOOC. That was the one that was recommended by Eugene Levy from Schitt's Creek. It always cracks me up saying that. I haven't done the one from the University of Toronto yet. So at this point, yeah, I will take any questions, comments, if you want to share anything. Now is the time. And then once again, I'll be emailing this PowerPoint to everybody who's on that participation list so that you can watch the videos. Catherine.
Thanks, Jaimie. I've been furiously scribbling down so many of the resources or taking screenshots. I really, really value everything you've been sharing. I just wanted to add another resource to the list. The online courses made me think about it. Wilfrid Laurier, at their social work program, they have the Center for Indigenous-led, I believe. I've taken the program, and they have a lot of different opportunities now. I think it's grown a lot since I took it a few years ago. So I highly recommend it. It's not free, but it is well worth the time and money.
That's right. I forgot about the Center for Indigeauga. Yes, one of my mentors, Darren Thomas. I'm looking to bring him in to do a session for us. So hopefully in the future, keep your eyes peeled for that. Absolutely love Darren. Go ahead, Megan.
The question I had was about music, actually. I put it in the chat, but I wasn't sure if anybody had a response to it. If I get something off of Spotify or Apple Music, where the person is Indigenous and the name is shared and maybe the name of the store, the title, I'm wondering if I do a little extra Google search on a little bit more around the artist, do I need to also approach the artist even though they've posted their material to Spotify and Apple? Okay, no.
No. When it's posted on sites like that, that's the equivalent for me. That's the equivalent of Isaac saying, "You've got my permission to use it."
And here's one other thing. We get students to move abstractly to music as a creative starter. Are we allowed, are there certain songs I should not have them move to because they're meant to only be heard? But if I set up who it is, give them credit, and they move abstractly to kind of get themselves warmed up, it's one of our exercises. We love to take music from all around the world to do that. What do you think of that?
No, I mean, it's the only, if you're selling it and you're making a profit off of it, then I would have a problem.
Okay.
Then I would say we need to talk.
Yeah.
No, but you see, I think of A Tribe Called Red. They just pop into my head right away, right? And their music is like, when we had the Idol No More, their music was being played over and over and over again. So unless there's a note specifically attached to the music saying you can't use this, I wouldn't, it would be okay by me. But that's me, right? So if in your gut, remember what I said, if in your gut you feel like you want to reach out to the creators, do so. You might be surprised what comes.
Great, thank you.
Hmm. So this is like the resources page, the references page. I I believe I put everything on there, but if I'm missing something and you want to know something specific, please don't hesitate to email me and let me know, okay? I'm here. I've said it before and I'll say it again and I'll keep saying it. Um, because of my grandma's experiences and because of the way I was raised, um, which was the loss of identity, I took the long, hard road to get to where I am today. I wouldn't trade it in for anything. The work that I'm doing, and sometimes I get that imposter feeling, like because I never thought that a university would be. Honestly, I just never saw a university doing that. I never saw any university trying to incorporate Indigenous knowledge. Universities were created for um, rich people, right? So to be able to bring this back to you and share it with you full circle kind of it's afforded me a certain amount of peace and to be okay with myself. um, and I know my grandma, I know she would be proud of me. If she were still here with us, I would have had her in talking to you all in a heartbeat. um, as it is now, though, like what I've said before with the finding of all the children, it's just a really raw time. So I just remember that if you are reaching out to Indigenous communities and you don't get an answer right away, don't take it personally. Um, we're all just going through a really raw time right now. So, well, you have to role model, right? Yeah, you have to show, you have to be the change you want to see. So if I'm vulnerable and I have these things, um, and I'm still working through it. I'm still working through it, right? So if I'm doing this work, you certainly can do the work, and we can help each other do some heavy lifting. It's all good. It's all good. And with that, I think I'm going to. You're also very welcome. I do appreciate you all coming here and being here with me today. Um, with that, I'm going to light a smudge, and I'm gonna just say a quick Bama which means see you later in Anishinaabe. So as I like this smudge, I got good thoughts. I'm grateful for this session. I'm grateful for my time with you all, and I hope that the Creator keeps you safe in His hands until the next time. So miigwech to you all, and with that, I'll say Bama